Good day. Today we need to look at specifically the domestic powers of the president. And generally we're looking at the powers of the president in comparison to the other branches throughout this unit of study. It's no doubt There's no doubt that the power of the president has increased widely over time, especially when compared to the way the founders had originally intended the office of the president to be in place. Article 1 covers the Congress, and there was a reason that Article 1 covers Congress, because they thought that Congress should be the most powerful branch of our government. And in that case, we have to look then at the power of the president and how it's evolved. And one of the key parts that we can look at is the domestic powers of the president, and we'll look later at the international or foreign powers, foreign policy powers of the president. So let's dive in and let's get started on these important domestic powers of the president. Buckle up. There's a lot of reasons that the presidential power has grown over time. Some of the potential reasons we could look at are the fact that America has been changing into, in the 20th century, changed into a global leader, and we are still, by many estimations, considered the world's superpower. And so the president embodies that role and that position, as we saw when we looked at the roles of the president. There's also a greater reliance on assistance from the national government as a result of the Great Depression and policies beyond that. Americans can identify with the president more readily than they can with members of Congress. And probably the most important is the use of the media as a tool to connect, or the bully pulpit in many cases that the office of the president is. The presidency is regularly called the most powerful office in the world, and it certainly is. But the question is, was that what the framers had in mind when they created the post in 1787? In Philadelphia, they purposely created the single executive with very broadly stated powers, but still they agreed with the sentiment that was expressed by Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence, in that a tyrant is, as he said, unfit to be the ruler of a free people. Thomas Jefferson wrote to a friend in 1789 when he said, "The execution of the laws is more important than the making of them." Now, whether Thomas Jefferson was right about that or not, in this unit, you're going to see that the president's power to execute the law gives that chief executive extraordinary authority. And probably one of the greatest examples of this is the use of the executive authority to build and to create the Panama Canal, which certainly made the United States a hegemon or a powerhouse within the Western Hemisphere. The power to execute the law also gives the president many broad powers to step in when there's conflict, especially with labor disputes. In this picture, you can see air traffic controllers are on strike in 1981. And President Ronald Reagan exercised his power to enforce federal laws in 1981 by firing all of the striking air traffic controllers. He said the strike was illegal according to a 1955 law passed by Congress. And this was considered widely a controversial use of the president's executive power. Now, the job of administering and applying most federal law is the day-to-day work of many of the departments, commissions, and the agencies of the federal government. There's 2.7 million civilian men and women who staff these agencies and are subjects to the president's control and direction. And you can see here the cabinet positions that are underneath the president and that report directly to the president and help our government function. A president certainly can't hope to succeed without loyal subordinates who support the policies of the president's administration. And so to that end, the Constitution says that the president has the power to appoint people to positions within the government to serve his needs. In this situation, you see Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice under President George W. Bush at the appointment of John Bolton to the ambassador to the United Nations. And this is an important function of the president, making sure that our voice is heard at the United Nations, and it's someone that he approves and that he is appointed to that position. President Obama, you can see here on the nomination of Justice Sonia Sotomayor to the Supreme Court in 2009, this is another important and still controversial power of the president to appoint people to fill vacancies on the Supreme Court. Now, I've said many times, the president's legacy lasts as long as his presidential appointments are on the Supreme Court, which is, of course, now why we have such a fight to replace Justice Antonin Scalia, who you can see in the background, between the president and Justice Sonia Sotomayor. And that fight between the Republicans in Congress and the president is a significant story within the use of the presidential appointment power. So when we look at who gets the job, the Senate has to approve all nominations. So the president nominates, and then a Senate committee examines that nominee and votes in committee. The entire Senate then debates, and if that nominee is rejected, the president nominates somebody else. If that nominee is confirmed by a simple majority in the Senate, then that person ends up with the job in the presidential appointment. This is true of executive agencies, as it is ambassadors, as it is members of the Supreme Court or other federal courts that the president has the right and duty to appoint. Now, sometimes when a president can't fill a position because the Senate is in recess, we call that a recess appointment. If you take a look, there have been a number of different presidents that have used recess appointments, but typically people give Barack Obama a hard time for using recess appointment. But note that every president before him, with the exception of Gerald Ford, has used the resource appointment power much more than he has. And if you look significantly, Ronald Reagan has used that appointment power to the most in modern times. Let's also talk about the power of presidential pardons, largely considered the most unchecked power and perhaps most potential for abuse when we talk about the power of the president. And the power of the presidential pardon is essentially for anything. If it's for reckless skateboarding or if it's for hiccups, that's not a crime, obviously, but if it's for, all these different things, you can pardon as president, and this becomes very controversial. Some famous pardons: the Whiskey Rebels of the Whiskey Rebellion were pardoned by George Washington in 1795. Brigham Young was pardoned in 1858 for fighting against U.S. Troops in rebellion. All Confederate soldiers were pardoned in 1868. The socialist political activist Eugene V. Debs, who had his citizenship revoked for violating the Espionage Act and was a socialist revolutionary, was pardoned in 1921. Jimmy Hoffa, the dubious and notorious leader of the Teamsters Union, was pardoned in 1971 for racketeering and jury tampering charges. Richard Nixon, not in 1074, but in 1974, was pardoned by Gerald Ford because the country needed to move on, Gerald Ford said, from the issues of Richard Nixon's Watergate scandal. Now, of note, Richard Nixon had not been accused of a crime, had not been charged with a crime. Richard Nixon was preemptively pardoned by Ford, which in fact goes on to cost Ford the election in 1976, and Jimmy Carter wins the presidency. Roger Clinton, the half-brother of Bill Clinton, was pardoned in 1997 on drug charges, and of course the famous pardons every year of the turkey at Thanksgiving time. But the power of the pardon is, again, unchecked. Nobody can say you can't do it. If the president wants to pardon somebody, they can without seeking permission of Congress. The Constitution says that every bill and every order, resolution, or vote to which the concurrence of the Senate and the House of Representatives may be necessary, except the question of adjournment, shall be presented to the President. And this gives the president another power that's very important, and that's the power of the presidential veto. Even the mere threat of a veto can cause Congress to act in line with what the president expects. If the president gets a bill that the president doesn't like or doesn't think is constitutional, the president has the power to veto that bill, and that bill is dead, unless the Congress can overturn that veto by a 2/3 vote. If we look at the presidential power of the veto, they have 4 options once a measure has been approved by Congress. They can sign the bill into law, they can veto the bill, they can ignore the bill and it becomes law after 14 days, or they can do what's called a pocket veto. They can hold on to that bill, and if Congress adjourns within 10 days, that bill he doesn't have to do anything with. It dies, it doesn't become law, and it's what we call a pocket veto, because the president held on to it in his pocket and waited until Congress adjourned, and the president can't be blamed. He can blame Congress for that, but we call that a pocket veto. President Johnson, you can see here, is signing a bill into law, creating the Department of Housing and Urban Development in 1965, and you can see all the little pens that are stacked up there because he's using those pens to sign each part of his signature, and they're used often, multiple pens are, to sign important bills, because then they become historical artifacts and they're handed out to the people that you see behind the president as a memento of this piece of legislation being signed into law. The power of the veto, as I said, is a very important way for the president to use his or her authority to strong-arm Congress into doing what he or she would like them to do. You can take a look at the use of the veto and its differing effects. You have a Republican president with George W. Bush. He vetoed one piece of legislation because the 109th Congress was a Republican majority. We call that an era of united government from 2005 to 2007, where there was no need for really any vetoes because the Congress and the president worked together, nor were there any need for any overrides of that veto because Congress and the president worked together. Now, you look at Gerald Ford from 75 to 77, and we have an era of divided government where the 94th Congress was controlled by Democrats. Gerald Ford was a Republican. There were 39 vetoes by the president, and Congress overrode those 39 vetoes 8 times. And so when you have an override, that becomes law above and beyond what the president would like, but the president still has to enforce the law. And that power and that back and forth struggle is what's characterized by our legislative process as the framers had intended. Now, I want you to take a look at the next video, which is on my website, which takes a look at the importance of one particular executive order and one particular power of the president, and that's the power and of President Truman desegregating the armed services, perhaps considered the start of the civil rights movement in the late 1940s, when President Truman decides it is time enough now to integrate the armed forces and bring white and black troops together in integrated units for the first time in American history. So we'll cue that video up and let's take a look at the importance and the use of the executive authority by President Truman.